All right, you read chapter 11, lesson 3 yesterday, and this is meant to be just a quick review over what you read and hopefully understood. You'll be taking a quiz today, just looking at the objectives of the lesson, just understanding the significance of cotton in the South. It became the main moneymaker not only for the South but for the country, and then what enslaved life was like for Southerners especially. Some terms, the cotton gin, pretty cool to see the technology differences from when it first started with Eli Whitney till now. Slave codes, which were laws written and unwritten that slaves had to abide by. Spirituals, referring to the culture that African Americans still maintained even though they were living in America. And then Nat Turner was a famous person, maybe infamous would be the right word, who led a slave revolt. You can connect the production of cotton to our previous lesson with the textile mills, understanding that as you could make more fabric, you would have a higher demand for cotton, and that's why you had such large plantations. There really was a big difference between the North and the South as far as their economies were concerned. The North was more of an industrial society, factories and mills. People were migrating to the cities. The South had climate that worked for growing cotton, and it was only natural that they would focus on cotton, which led to the need for slaves. The cotton gin made a big difference in production of cotton simply because it was so time consuming to pick cotton out or seeds out of cotton by hand, and the cotton gin sped that up. With the invention of the cotton gin and use of slavery, you can understand that cotton production would skyrocket and became the United States' greatest source of wealth, impacted not only plantations and farmers, but other industries as well, bankers and ship owners. Along with the production of cotton, you would need more manpower, and slavery then increased as well. You can see the growth of slavery here from 1800 to 1860. Prices of slaves went up as well as the demand. African Americans obviously had no rights as slaves, and we'll take a closer look at slave codes a little bit later. You can see some of the tasks here. Some worked in owners' homes, but most were working out in the fields with heavy farm labor. Working conditions were what we've read about and heard about in history books. Oftentimes slaves punished, whipped, beaten, even killed. It says here that slaves valued or were valued by their owners, but not necessarily in an appropriate way, but as a labor force. And it was very common for slave owners to break apart families. Makes sense to divide and conquer in a way. The textbook mentioned just culture, and certainly African American culture still impacts America today. Spirituals were mentioned, folk songs in our textbook, dance. And we know about slave resistance at times. One of the most famous is Nat Turner, who our textbook tells us killed 60 people. That was squashed and put down. And in fact, it had a negative impact on other slaves in a way they were guilty by association being their skin color. Whites became pretty fearful that slaves would begin to revolt, and it really just made things more difficult for slaves with stricter restrictions and laws. Eventually, slavery wasn't banned, but it was illegal to import new slaves from Africa. Southerners made the ridiculous argument that slavery was actually more humane than the northern system of labor. They would make arguments such as, well, at least they don't have to worry about unemployment. This slide shows well the comparison of population between whites and African Americans, and this helps you understand why whites would have to have a lot of control and regulation over African Americans. With that many slaves, if there were revolts or uprisings, that could be a problem for their labor force. About 6% of African Americans in the South were free. That isn't many. And our book tells us about a couple of people who made contributions that were important: sugar refining and seed planting inventions, and some examples of black codes. African Americans, given the most menial jobs, weren't allowed to travel, couldn't attend public school, couldn't vote, couldn't testify against a white person. And slave catchers would not only catch slaves that ran away, but they would also at times kidnap innocent or free people and then turn them over as slaves for a ransom. The Cotton Kingdom Society is addressed in the textbook, speaking to the life of plantation owners, and says more than half of all Southerners did not have slaves. It's a lot like today. History books won't write about you and me. Instead, they'll write about the Bill Gates of the world and the Jeff Bezos of the world and the Donald Trumps of the world. But the reality is far more people don't live like that. The same was true in the South. Not everyone was living on a plantation. Most people had small farms. Most or many did not have slaves and living modestly, raising hogs and chicken and corn. After you finish viewing this, you can move on over to your Socrative account and take your quiz.